run public bodies pose a threat to our economic program and fiscal certainty.
Jamaica is in the middle of the largest airport expansion program in the island's history. A new international airport is being planned from the ground up at a cost of $460 million. The country's busiest airport is being designed to handle 5 million passengers a year. The capital city's main gateway is under a $161 million redevelopment, and the government has committed over $500 million to airport infrastructure through 2029. At the same time, domestic flights between Kingston and Montego Bay have resumed for the first time in 10 years, a 25-minute journey that replaces what had been a 2.5-hour drive. Taken together, these are not routine infrastructure updates. They represent a significant shift in how Jamaica is planning its aviation future. But behind every one of these projects is a funding question. Airport infrastructure at this scale does not build itself, and Jamaica is not a country with unlimited fiscal resources. The government has spent years working to reduce a national debt that once exceeded 150% of gross domestic product. The money has to come from somewhere. When you trace the investment lines behind Jamaica's aviation expansion, the concession agreements, the public-private partnerships, the foreign loans, and the construction contracts, you find a picture that is considerably more layered than the official announcements suggest. It involves Mexican and Canadian airport operators, Spanish planning firms, an Antiguan Nigerian airline joint venture, and a Beijing-based engineering company that has already spent $2 billion building infrastructure across this island. This is an examination of Jamaica's airport system. What has been built, what is planned, who is financing in it, and what the long-term implications of those financing arrangements are. To understand the current expansion, it is necessary to understand the collapse that preceded it. Air Jamaica launched its first commercial flight in April 1969, 7 years after Jamaican independence. It grew through the 1970s, adding routes to Toronto, Montreal, Philadelphia, and cities across the Caribbean. In April 1974, it extended to long-haul service, Kingston to London Heathrow, continuing to Frankfurt. By the early 1980s, it was operating Boeing 747s on the transatlantic corridor. The airline was a significant national institution. It connected Jamaica to the world at a time when the country was still establishing its international identity. At its operational peak, Air Jamaica served New York, Miami, Toronto, Montreal, London, Frankfurt, and multiple Caribbean destinations. The economics of operating a national carrier, however, proved unsustainable over time. Air Jamaica required government subsidies, accumulated debt, and struggled to compete against larger international carriers in its own market. In May 2010, the Jamaican government sold the airline to Caribbean Airlines, the Trinidad-based carrier, retaining a 16% stake in the acquiring company. Caribbean Airlines continued operating under the Air Jamaica brand before retiring it entirely. By 2015, Air Jamaica had ceased all operations. The domestic network suffered separately and earlier. Air Jamaica Express, the domestic subsidiary, had connected Kingston, Montego Bay, Ocho Rios, Negril, and Port Antonio. It ceased operations in October 2005 after failing to secure the capital needed to continue. Several operators attempted to fill the gap over the following years. Jamaica Air Shuttle began service in December 2009 but was grounded in February 2013 when its aircraft lessor withdrew. Jam Airlink Express started in July 2019 but did not sustain scheduled service. The result was a 10-year period, from approximately 2015 through 2025. During which there were no regular domestic commercial flights between Kingston and Montego Bay. The island's two largest urban centers, separated by roughly 200 kilometers of road, were connected exclusively by highway. The typical journey took 2.5 hours by car and up to 3.5 hours by bus. That gap closed on the 11th of July 2025 when LIAT Airlines launched domestic service between the two cities. The flight time, 25 minutes. The carrier operating Jamaica's new domestic route is not the original LIAT. LIAT, the Leeward Islands Air Transport, was established in 1956 and operated through most of the 20th century as the main inter-island carrier across the Eastern Caribbean. It connected small island nations that larger airlines would not economically serve. It ran on subsidies from Caribbean governments for decades, accumulated substantial debts, and shut down operations during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. LIAT 2020 Limited is a separate entity. It is a joint venture between the government of Antigua and Barbuda and Air Peace, a Nigerian airline. It began new operations on the 6th of August 2024. On the 2nd of July 2025, Shane Munro, Chief Executive Officer of MBJ Airports Limited, announced at the Sangster Airport Forum that LIAT would begin operating between Montego Bay, Kingston, and Antigua and Barbuda, 3 flights per week out of Sangster International Airport. The domestic service between Kingston and Montego Bay launched on the 11th of July. Ticket prices were set at $122. Munro stated that Montego Bay had not had direct air connectivity to any Caribbean destination for a considerable period, and described the domestic route as a long-awaited development. Jamaica's tourism ministry also welcomed the service. A state minister cited double-digit growth in Caribbean visitor arrivals and identified corporate travelers as a primary beneficiary. The practical significance of the service is clear. A 25-minute flight between Jamaica's business capital and its tourism center reduces travel time substantially for executive travel, enables same-day business trips between the two cities, and creates a connecting option for tourists arriving on one side of the island who want to reach the other. The commercial risks are equally clear. 3 flights per week at $122 a ticket is a limited initial operation. Previous domestic operators, Air Jamaica Express, Jamaica Air Shuttle, Jam Airlink Express, each entered the market with similar assessments of demand and did not maintain scheduled services long-term. The Caribbean domestic aviation market is commercially difficult. Passenger volumes are small, fuel costs are high, aircraft maintenance is expensive, and ticket prices that are accessible enough to sustain consistent load factors tend to compress margins to unsustainable levels. For the current service to be commercially viable, it will need demand that extends beyond corporate travelers. Tourism-driven passengers, visitors moving between Kingston and Montego Bay, and transit passengers arriving through Antigua represent the broader base the route needs to function at sustainable load factors. The LIAT service and the airport infrastructure expansion are therefore directly interdependent. The more Jamaica increases total aviation capacity and tourism throughput, the more viable domestic connections become. That relationship runs through every project in the current program. Transport Minister Darrell Vaz outlined Jamaica's Airport Capital Program at the Sangster Airport Forum on the 2nd of July 2025. The figures cover both the government-operated Airports Authority of Jamaica facilities and the 2 privately operated concession airports. The total committed capital program for fiscal year 2025 to 2026, $152 million. For the 2026 to 2029 period, $372 million, combined over $500 million through the end of the decade. Separately, a new 4th international airport is planned at an estimated cost of $460 million. Each airport in the network is at a different stage of investment and development. Sangster International Airport, Montego Bay Sangster, is Jamaica's busiest airport and the primary entry point for international tourists. By mid-2025, it was approaching 5 million passengers annually. The airport operates under a 30-year concession agreement held by MBJ Airports Limited, owned 75% by Grupo Aeroportuario del Pacífico, GAP of Mexico, and 25% by Vantage Group of Canada. GAP entered the Jamaican market in 2003. Since the pandemic, MBJ has invested $26 million in runway expansion, taxiway improvements, and terminal upgrades as part of a capital program of $112 million, covering 2020 to 2025. A new 5-year capital cycle covering 2026 to 2030 is being finalized at $118 million. Planned works include an East Concourse expansion, extending the departures hold room to add lounge seating and boarding space, along with additional aircraft stands, upgraded customs and baggage claim facilities, new security systems, and emergency equipment. The concession agreement expires in 2034. Minister Vaz confirmed in July 2025 that the government will begin early discussions on extension, noting that investment slows as concession end dates approach. and that Jamaica cannot afford reduced investment at its primary international gateway during any transition period. Norman Manley International Airport. Kingston Norman Manley recorded 1,777,000 passengers in 2024. It is Jamaica's second busiest airport, operating from the Palisados Peninsula on the southern edge of Kingston, a narrow strip of land extending into Kingston Harbour, which is one of the deepest natural harbours in the Western Hemisphere. The airport is operated by PAC Kingston Airport Limited, PACL, a GAP subsidiary, under a 25-year concession agreement signed in 2019. Under the original terms, GAP committed to $100 million in medium-term upgrades, including runway extension. Those plans were slowed during the pandemic. PACL is currently implementing a $161 million redevelopment program. In May 2026, it was preparing to invite bids for a major commercial expansion, including a new link corridor housing 4 concession spaces. The airport's departure experience score, measured by the Airports Council International Airport Service Quality Program, rose to 4.02 in the first quarter of 2026 from 3.99 in the third quarter of 2025. Spanish infrastructure planning firm Ineco holds a contract to develop master plans for Norman Manley, covering 2025 to 2034 and 2035 to 2054. Ian Fleming International Airport. Ocho Rios Ian Fleming International is located in St. Mary Parish on Jamaica's north coast, named for the British author, who maintained a private estate near Oracabessa. It is Jamaica's third international airport, serving the Ocho Rios Resort Corridor. Ineco also holds the master planning contract for Ian Fleming, covering the same long-range periods as Norman Manley. The growth projections for this airport are significant. For the September 2025 through February 2026 winter season, Jamaica projected a 37% increase in overall seat capacity through Ian Fleming, substantially above the 4.4% system-wide increase projected across all 3 existing international airports for the same period. The Little London Airport, Westmoreland, the most consequential addition to Jamaica's airport network, is a proposed 4th international airport on the western coast. In November 2024, the Airports Authority of Jamaica selected Little London in Westmoreland Parish as the site. The location sits approximately 20 minutes from Negril's 7-mile beach strip. The selection followed a process that ruled out expanding the existing Negril aerodrome, which sits adjacent to the Great Morass, a wetland system that protects the beaches central to Negril's tourism identity. On the 2nd of July 2025, Minister Vaz confirmed the project is advancing through the public investment appraisal process. The estimated total cost is $460 million to be implemented in phases through a public-private partnership. The initial runway will measure 2,240 meters, sufficient for aircraft on routes as far as Canada. The airport is intended to serve Westmoreland, Hanover, and sections of St. James. Horace Bryson, Senior Director of Engineering, Maintenance and Projects at the Airports Authority of Jamaica, previously indicated that construction timelines would be confirmed following government approval of the master plan. Tinson Pen Aerodrome. Kingston Tinson Pen Aerodrome on Marcus Garvey Drive in Kingston is the largest of Jamaica's domestic airports. It served approximately 92,000 passengers in 2001. It currently operates primarily as a general aviation and charter facility. Its long-term future is under review. The aerodrome sits in a densely developed urban area adjacent to Kingston Harbour and near the Kingston Free Zone. Minister Vaz confirmed in July 2025 that consultants have been engaged to assess the feasibility of relocating Tinson Pen operations to Norman Manley International Airport. A parallel study has been commissioned to identify alternative aerodrome sites should relocation prove impractical. Both studies were targeted for completion by September 2025. The resolution of the Tinson Pen question has direct relevance to the LIAT domestic service, since the Kingston end of that operation currently depends on facilities at a site whose long-term status is not yet decided. The question of who finances Jamaica's airport expansion cannot be fully addressed without examining who has been financing Jamaica's broader infrastructure and for how long. China Harbour Engineering Company, CHEC, is a subsidiary of China Communications Construction Company, one of the largest state-owned engineering corporations in the People's Republic of China. CHEC operates from Jamaica as its Caribbean regional hub, overseeing projects across 14 countries in the region. By the end of 2022, CHEC had undertaken nearly 20 projects in Jamaica. The combined value was $2 billion. The projects covered highways, ports, airports, and logistics centers. Among them, Jamaica's North-South Highway, a 65-kilometer four-lane corridor linking Kingston to the north coast. Completed in 2016, was described at the time as the single largest infrastructure investment ever made by a Chinese company overseas. The relationship was formalized in November 2019 when Prime Minister Andrew Holness signed Jamaica's entry into China's Belt and Road Initiative during a visit to Beijing. Former Chinese Ambassador Tian Chi was present for the signing. Jamaica became the first Caribbean country to formally join the Belt and Road program. The first Belt and Road project was the Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project, SCIP, which began construction in 2019 at a value of $380 million, with 85% of financing from the Export-Import Bank of China. The project involves a 28-kilometer extension of the West-East Highway, a 17-kilometer expressway from Harborview to Yalas, and rehabilitation of over 119 kilometers of coastal roads. CHEC's involvement continues. In June 2025, Jamaica awarded the company a contract to design and construct an expanded logistics center at Kingston Port, where cargo volumes had increased by over 50% relative to pre-pandemic levels. The connection to airports is also documented. When Jamaica conducted a competitive tender for the Norman Manley International Airport concession, CHEC was among the 5 pre-qualified bidders, partnering with DEA International of Ireland. The concession was ultimately awarded to Grupo Aeroportuario del Pacifico in 2019. CHEC did not win, but its presence in that process reflects the company's established interest in Jamaican aviation infrastructure. In March 2024, the commander of United States Southern Command issued a public statement on the risks of Chinese investment in South American and Caribbean infrastructure. The concern centered on the strategic advantages that could accrue through influence over ports and airports in the Western Hemisphere, advantages that would not require a formal military presence to be operationally significant. Norman Manley International Airport's location is relevant to that framing. It sits at the tip of the Palisadoes, adjacent to Kingston Harbour, one of the deepest natural harbors in the hemisphere. The airport's physical geography carries dimensions beyond its commercial function. China's total documented financing of Jamaican projects stood at $2.28 billion as of 2024. Chinese loans account for approximately 3.9% of Jamaica's total loan portfolio, a relatively modest share, but concentrated in high-visibility infrastructure. Jamaica's stated policy, as articulated by the Holness government, is that it will not take on additional direct Chinese government debt. Future Chinese-affiliated involvement will be structured as joint ventures or public-private partnerships rather than sovereign loans. That policy shapes the financial architecture of the proposed Little London Airport, a $460 million PPP in a market with a limited pool of qualified airport developers and financiers, means the identity of the eventual partner carries consequences beyond the immediate construction contract. The field includes Latin American airport operators, European infrastructure groups, South Korean conglomerates, and Chinese state-affiliated firms with existing and extensive relationships in Jamaica. The decision on that partner, when it is made, will determine the operating terms of a major piece of national infrastructure for several decades. The $500 million airport capital figure covers projects financed through 4 different mechanisms, with different risk profiles and different implications for Jamaica's public finances. For Sangster International and Norman Manley, the financing is private. GAP and Vantage Group are investing through the MBJ concession. PACL is funding the Norman Manley redevelopment through GAP's concession revenues and private financing arrangements. Jamaica's government is not the borrower in either case. It provides the regulatory and concession framework. The private operators carry the capital risk and earn returns from airport revenues over the life of their agreements. This is the model Jamaica has used since GAP entered the market in 2003. It allows substantial capital investment without adding to government debt, and it ties investment levels to commercial performance rather than public budget cycles. For the Airports Authority of Jamaica facilities, Ian Fleming, Tinson Pen, and the domestic aerodromes, funding comes through the AAJ's capital program, supported by government appropriations, multilateral lending, and development grants where available. The AAJ is a statutory government body, and its liabilities sit within the public sector balance sheet. For the Little London Airport, the PPP structure is intended to replicate the concession model used at Sangster and Norman Manley. A private partner would finance, design, build, and operate the facility under a long-term agreement. Jamaica would retain a share of revenues and policy oversight. The government bears less financial risk under this model, but cedes a portion of long-term revenue and a degree of operational influence to whoever holds the concession. The fiscal rationale is direct. At $460 million, the airport cannot be funded through direct government borrowing without materially affecting Jamaica's debt reduction trajectory. That trajectory has taken over a decade of sustained fiscal discipline to achieve, from a debt-to-GDP ratio approaching 150% down to approximately 78% as of 2023, according to Fitch Ratings projections. The PPP route is not simply a policy preference. It is a fiscal constraint. What that means in practice is that the specific terms of the PPP agreement, when negotiated, will be significant. The concession period, the revenue sharing formula, the scope of the partner's operational authority, the government's ability to set pricing and access policy. Each of these will determine whether Jamaica builds an airport that serves its long-term interests or enters an arrangement that transfers more value to a private investor than it retains. Jamaica's airport expansion is taking place within a competitive environment that gives the investment its economic rationale. The Caribbean tourism industry generates tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue. The Dominican Republic, Barbados, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, St. Lucia, and Turks and Caicos each deploy infrastructure investment strategies oriented specifically toward attracting more airlift, more direct routes, and more high-spending visitors. Access infrastructure is a primary competitive variable. Airlines make route decisions based on airport quality, operational efficiency, and commercial conditions. Investors in hotel and resort development factor airport capacity and reliability into project feasibility assessments. Jamaica's competitive position has been constrained by infrastructure that has lagged behind the scale of its tourism ambitions. The North-South Highway and Southern Coastal Highway have addressed the road network. The current airport program addresses the remaining major gap in connectivity. The measurable effect of each project on competitive positioning is significant. A domestic route between Kingston and Montego Bay enables Jamaica to be marketed as multi-center destination. Cultural and heritage tourism in Kingston, beach and resort tourism in Montego Bay, accessible within a single itinerary. A new airport at Little London gives Negril, one of the most internationally recognized beach destinations in the Caribbean, direct international air access rather than dependence on ground transfers from Montego Bay. The demand data supports the investment scale. From September 2025 through February 2026, Jamaica projected system-wide seat capacity growth of 4.4% across its three international airports. Sangster up 5.6%, Norman Manley up 1.3%, and Ian Fleming up 37%. That growth is occurring ahead of most of the current infrastructure projects reaching completion. The investment is being sized to accommodate demand that is already materializing. Jamaica's airport investment program is substantively real and substantially funded. LIAT launched domestic service on the 11th of July 2025. Sangster International is implementing a $118 million capital cycle through 2030. Norman Manley is midway through a $161 million redevelopment. Ian Fleming recorded 37% capacity growth in a single season. The Little London Airport has a completed master plan, a confirmed site, a cost estimate, and an active public investment appraisal process. The domestic LIAT service faces structural commercial risks that previous operators encountered and did not overcome. 3 flights per week is a viable start only if demand grows to justify expansion. LIAT 2020 Limited is a recently established entity that has not yet demonstrated long-term commercial sustainability. The viability of the route will depend on load factors that cannot be assumed on the basis of earlier airline failures in the same market. The financing structure used for the concession airports, Sangster and Norman Manley, has a track record and has delivered sustained private investment without burdening government accounts. Applying that model to Little London is reasonable in principle. Its effectiveness depends on the quality of the concession terms negotiated and on the level of competitive tension in the tender process. China Harbour Engineering Company's presence in Jamaica is extensive, documented, and directly relevant to airport decisions. CHEC has previously bid for Jamaican airport concessions. It holds active construction contracts on the island. Jamaica's stated policy of using PPP and joint venture structures rather than direct sovereign debt is the appropriate response to that context. Whether that policy is applied with sufficient rigor in the Little London concession process and in any subsequent airport-related tenders will determine how much operational and financial control remains with the Jamaican public over the long term. Jamaica's debt reduction from near 150% of GDP required over a decade of fiscal discipline. The airport program is being financed in ways that are largely consistent with protecting that trajectory. The risk is not that the wrong choices are obviously being made. The risk is that individual agreement terms in PPP negotiations, concession extensions, and long-term operating contracts may not fully reflect Jamaica's interests if negotiated under time pressure or without sufficient competitive alternatives. That is the framework through which Jamaica's airport investments should continue to be assessed as they move through procurement and into construction over the next 5 to 10 years. Jamaica's air connectivity is improving on a measurable and documented basis. The investment commitments are real, the strategic rationale is sound, and the first domestic service in 10 years is operating. The more durable question is not whether Jamaica is building airports, but on what terms that infrastructure will operate and whose interests those terms will serve for the decades that follow completion. If this analysis was useful to you, subscribe to Caribbean Journey. We are working toward 10,000 subscribers, and every one of them represents someone who takes Caribbean economic and infrastructure reporting seriously. Leave your assessment in the comments. Is Jamaica's approach to financing this infrastructure program adequately protecting the country's long-term interests, or are there terms being conceded that deserve more public scrutiny? More analysis follows.